Captain Sarah Mitchell pressed her helmet against the headrest as her A-10 Thunderbolt II roared through the desert sky. The massive twin engines behind her cockpit pushed the aircraft forward at a steady pace, though speed was never the Warthog's greatest strength. What made this plane legendary was its ability to take punishment and keep flying, just like Sarah had learned to do throughout her military career. The radio crackled with chatter from the forward air controller on the ground. Enemy forces had been spotted moving through a narrow canyon about 15 miles ahead. Sarah's job was simple in theory but dangerous in practice: provide close air support to the troops pinned down below. She had done this mission dozens of times before, but something felt different today. The intelligence reports had been scattered and contradictory. Some said the enemy had anti-aircraft weapons. Others claimed the area was clear. Sarah pushed those doubts aside as she began her descent toward the target area. The A-10's distinctive sound filled the cockpit as she reduced power and started her attack run. Below her, the rocky terrain stretched out like a brown and tan carpet, broken by deep ravines and scattered vegetation. She could see the dust clouds kicked up by vehicles moving through the canyon. As she lined up for her first pass, Sarah noticed movement on the ridgelines surrounding the canyon. Small flashes caught her eye, and her training immediately identified them as muzzle flashes from small arms fire. The troops on the ground were definitely in contact with enemy forces. She keyed her radio to confirm the target location with the ground controller. The voice that came back was strained and urgent. The ground team was taking heavy fire from multiple positions. They needed immediate air support to break contact and evacuate wounded soldiers. Sarah acknowledged the transmission and began setting up her attack. She switched her weapons systems to the 30mm Jaw U-8 cannon, the massive gun that gave the A-10 its fearsome reputation. Banking left to approach from the north, Sarah felt the familiar weight of the armored cockpit around her. The A-10 was built like a flying tank, designed to protect its pilot from ground fire while delivering devastating firepower to enemy positions. She had complete confidence in her aircraft and her training. What she didn't know was that enemy forces had moved sophisticated surface-to-air missiles into the area just hours before her arrival. The first indication of trouble came as a warning tone in her headset. Her radar warning receiver had detected the characteristic signal of a tracking radar. Sarah's eyes immediately went to her instruments, scanning for the source and type of threat. The display showed a SAM site somewhere below her, but the exact location remained unclear. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She began defensive maneuvers, dropping chaff and flares while changing her heading and altitude. The A-10 wasn't built for high-speed evasion like a fighter jet, but it was tough enough to survive hits that would down other aircraft. She continued her approach toward the target area, knowing that the soldiers on the ground were counting on her support. The missile launch came without warning. One moment Sarah was focused on her attack run, and the next moment her aircraft was shaking violently as something slammed into her left engine. The cockpit filled with warning lights and alarms as she fought to maintain control. Smoke began pouring from the damaged engine, and she could feel the aircraft pulling to one side. Sarah's hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency, shutting down the damaged engine and adjusting her flight controls to compensate for the asymmetric thrust. The A-10 was designed to fly on one engine, and she had trained for this exact scenario countless times. What worried her more was the possibility of additional missiles in the air. Another impact shook the aircraft, this time hitting the right wing. Sarah felt debris flying past her canopy as part of her wing was torn away. The aircraft became much harder to control, and she realized she was losing hydraulic pressure in multiple systems. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, but she was still airborne and still fighting. Looking down at her instruments, Sarah made the difficult decision to abort the attack and try to reach friendly territory. The soldiers on the ground would have to hold out until another aircraft could provide support. Her primary concern now was getting her damaged A-10 back to base, or at least to a location where she could safely eject. As she turned toward home, Sarah caught sight of two F-16 Fighting Falcons approaching from the east. Relief flooded through her as she recognized the distinctive silhouettes of the fighter jets. Help was on the way, and she might not have to face this emergency alone. She keyed her radio to establish contact with the F-16 pilots. The response she received was professional, but distant. The lead pilot acknowledged her emergency and offered to escort her toward friendly territory. Sarah accepted gratefully and began following the F-16s as they led her away from the combat area. What she didn't realize was that her tail number would soon reveal a secret that would change everything about this mission and her relationship with these pilots. The lead F-16 pilot, Major Jake Stevens, kept his aircraft positioned slightly ahead and to the right of the damaged A-10. From his vantage point, he could see the extent of the damage to the Warthog. Smoke continued to trail from the left engine, and there were obvious holes in the right wing. He had seen combat damage before, but this A-10 looked like it had been through a meat grinder and somehow kept flying. Jake's wingman, Lieutenant Colonel Mike Rodriguez, was flying formation on the left side of the A-10. Mike had more experience than Jake, having flown combat missions in 3 different conflicts over his 15-year career. He was impressed by the A-10 pilot's skill in maintaining control of such a badly damaged aircraft. The Warthog was living up to its reputation for toughness. Sarah's voice came over the radio again, requesting vectors to the nearest friendly airfield. She was maintaining a calm, professional tone despite her desperate situation. Jake consulted his navigation display and gave her a heading that would take them to a forward operating base about 40 miles away. At the A-10's reduced speed, it would take them nearly 20 minutes to reach safety. As they flew together, Jake found himself studying the A-10 more closely. Something about the aircraft seemed familiar, though he couldn't quite place what it was. The camouflage paint scheme was standard for A-10s operating in this theater, and the overall configuration looked normal despite the battle damage. Yet there was something nagging at the back of his mind. Mike's voice broke into Jake's thoughts over the radio. He was reporting another SAM launch from the area they had just left. The enemy was still active and dangerous, which meant more American aircraft could be at risk. Jake made a mental note to pass that information to the Air Operations Center as soon as they got the damaged A-10 to safety. Sarah was fighting a constant battle to keep her aircraft under control. The damage to her flight controls was becoming more apparent as systems continued to fail. She had lost most of her hydraulic pressure, which meant she was relying on manual reversion for basic flight controls. Every input required significant physical effort, and she was already feeling fatigue in her arms and shoulders. The F-16 pilots maintained their escort position as they crossed into friendly territory. Jake called ahead to the forward operating base to alert them about the incoming emergency. The tower controller acknowledged and began preparing for an emergency landing. Fire trucks and rescue personnel would be standing by in case the A-10 didn't make it to the runway. As they approached the airfield, Sarah attempted to lower her landing gear. The main gear extended normally, but the nose gear remained stuck in the up position. She tried the emergency extension procedure, but the damaged hydraulic system wasn't providing enough pressure to complete the operation. She would have to attempt a landing with only her main gear. Jake watched the A-10's predicament with growing concern. A landing without nose gear was dangerous under the best of circumstances, but with all the other damage to the aircraft, it could easily turn into a catastrophic crash. He offered to stay in the pattern and provide updates to the tower during the landing attempt. Sarah acknowledged the offer and began setting up for her approach. She would need to keep the nose of the aircraft elevated as long as possible during the landing rollout, using aerodynamic forces to prevent the nose from dropping too quickly. It would require precise control inputs and perfect timing, all while dealing with an aircraft that was barely responding to her commands. The approach went smoothly until Sarah was about 50 feet above the runway. Suddenly, her remaining engine began losing power. The damaged aircraft started sinking faster than she could compensate for. She added full power, but the engine was no longer producing enough thrust to maintain a stable approach. She was going to hit short of the runway. Jake watched in horror as the A-10 disappeared behind a small hill just short of the airfield. A column of black smoke began rising from the crash site within seconds. He immediately called the tower to report the crash and request emergency vehicles to respond to the location. His heart sank as he realized the pilot probably hadn't survived such a violent impact. Mike had already turned his F-16 toward the crash site to assess the situation from above. As he overflew the area, he was amazed to see the A-10's cockpit canopy opening and a figure climbing out of the wreckage. The pilot had somehow survived the crash and was moving under her own power. He immediately reported this information to the rescue teams approaching the site. Sarah pulled herself clear of the smoking wreckage and stumbled away from the aircraft. Her body ached from the impact, but she appeared to have avoided serious injury. The A-10's armored cockpit had protected her from the worst of the crash forces. She sat down on a nearby rock and began removing her helmet, grateful to be alive after such a harrowing experience. The rescue vehicles reached the crash site within minutes. Medics immediately began checking Sarah for injuries while firefighters worked to suppress the fuel fire that had erupted around the wreckage. She was conscious and alert, answering questions about her condition and what had happened during the mission. Jake circled overhead, watching the rescue operation unfold below. He felt relief knowing that the A-10 pilot had survived, but he was also curious about who she was. It wasn't common to encounter female A-10 pilots in this theater of operations. As the rescue teams worked, he decided to land at the base and check on the pilot's condition in person. After landing and shutting down his F-16, Jake walked toward the medical tent where the A-10 pilot was being examined. He wanted to congratulate her on her flying skills and her survival. As he approached the tent, he could hear her talking with the medical staff about the mission and the missile attack that had damaged her aircraft. When Jake finally saw the pilot's face as the medics removed her oxygen mask, recognition hit him like a physical blow. He stopped walking and stared in disbelief. This wasn't just any A-10 pilot. This was someone he knew, someone he had thought he would never see again. The tail number on her crashed aircraft would confirm what he was beginning to suspect, and when it did, everything about this day would take on a completely different meaning. Jake's mind raced as he stared at the pilot sitting on the medical examination table. The face was older now, marked by years of military service and the stress of combat flying, but there was no mistaking those distinctive green eyes and the small scar above her left eyebrow. This was Sarah Mitchell, the same Sarah Mitchell who had been his flight instructor at pilot training 8 years ago. The memories came flooding back in a rush. Sarah had been a young captain then, fresh from her A-10 training and assigned to teach new pilots the basics of military flying. Jake had been a cocky second lieutenant who thought he knew everything about aviation. Sarah had quickly shown him how much he still had to learn, but she had done it with patience and skill that had shaped him into the pilot he was today. Jake remembered the long hours they had spent in briefing rooms, going over emergency procedures and combat tactics. Sarah had pushed him harder than any other instructor, never accepting mediocre performance and always demanding excellence. At the time, he had found her demanding style frustrating, but he later realized that her high standards had probably saved his life more than once during actual combat missions. What Jake remembered most clearly was the last time he had seen Sarah. It was during the final week of pilot training, just before graduation. She had pulled him aside after a particularly challenging training flight and told him that he had the potential to be an exceptional pilot if he learned to control his overconfidence. She had wished him luck in his assignment to F-16s and told him to stay safe. That conversation had taken place just 2 days before Sarah disappeared. Jake had heard the rumors and whispers around the base. Sarah had been selected for a classified assignment that required her to transfer immediately to an undisclosed location. Her departure had been so sudden that she hadn't even been able to attend the graduation ceremony for the pilot training class she had been teaching. Now, 8 years later, Jake was looking at Sarah in a medical tent at a forward operating base in a combat zone. She was older and obviously more experienced, but she was alive and apparently still flying A-10s in combat. Jake felt a mixture of relief and confusion as he tried to process this unexpected reunion. Mike Rodriguez appeared at Jake's shoulder, having landed his F-16 shortly after Jake. He noticed his wingman standing motionless and staring at the medical tent. Mike followed Jake's gaze and saw the female A-10 pilot being examined by the medical team. He wondered why Jake seemed so transfixed by the scene. Sarah looked up from the medical examination and noticed the 2 F-16 pilots standing near the entrance to the tent. She recognized them as the pilots who had escorted her to safety after her aircraft was damaged. She wanted to thank them for their assistance, but something about the way one of them was staring at her seemed familiar. When Sarah's eyes met Jake's across the tent, recognition dawned on her face as well. She had taught dozens of student pilots over the years, but Jake Stevens had been one of the most memorable. His combination of natural flying ability and reckless overconfidence had made him both her most promising and most frustrating student. She had often wondered what had become of him after pilot training. The medical officer completed his examination and declared Sarah fit for duty, despite some minor bruises and scratches from the crash. She would need to be observed for a few hours to watch for signs of concussion, but she appeared to have escaped serious injury. Sarah thanked the medics and walked toward the tent entrance where Jake and Mike were waiting. Jake stepped forward as Sarah approached. He wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. After 8 years of wondering what had happened to his instructor, he found himself face to face with her in the most unlikely of circumstances. Sarah smiled and extended her hand in greeting, breaking the awkward silence that had developed. Sarah spoke first, her voice carrying the same confident tone Jake remembered from their training days. She thanked both F-16 pilots for their escort and assistance during her emergency. She introduced herself using her rank and last name, following military protocol even though she had recognized Jake immediately. Jake introduced himself and Mike, trying to keep his voice steady and professional. He wanted to acknowledge their previous relationship, but he wasn't sure if Sarah would want their personal history discussed in front of Mike and the other personnel around the medical tent. Military culture valued discretion, especially when it came to relationships between instructors and former students. Mike sensed the tension between Jake and Sarah, though he didn't understand its source. He congratulated Sarah on her flying skills and her survival, then excused himself to check on the status of their F-16s. He wanted to give Jake and Sarah some privacy to work through whatever was happening between them. After Mike left, Sarah and Jake stood looking at each other for a long moment. 8 years of separation and unanswered questions hung in the air between them. Sarah finally spoke, asking Jake about his assignment and his experience flying F-16s in combat. Jake answered her questions, but he could tell she was avoiding the more personal aspects of their reunion. Jake finally worked up the courage to ask Sarah about her disappearance from pilot training. He told her about the rumors and speculation that had followed her sudden departure. Sarah's expression became guarded, and she explained that she had been selected for a classified assignment that required immediate transfer. She couldn't discuss the details, but she assured him that everything had worked out well for her career. As they talked, Jake noticed other personnel beginning to examine the wreckage of Sarah's A-10. He could see them copying down the tail number and taking photographs of the aircraft. Something about their methodical approach suggested this wasn't just a routine accident investigation. There seemed to be special interest in documenting every detail of the crashed aircraft. Sarah noticed the same activity around her aircraft wreckage. Her expression became more serious as she watched the investigators at work. She told Jake that she needed to report to the base operations center for debriefing about her mission and the missile attack. Before she left, she asked Jake if he would be staying at the base overnight. Jake confirmed that he and Mike would be remaining at the base until the next morning. Sarah said she would try to find him later that evening, if her debriefing sessions didn't run too late. There were things they needed to discuss, and she suggested they could talk more privately after she completed her official duties. As Sarah walked toward the operations center, Jake watched her go with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. He had the feeling that Sarah's reappearance in his life was going to lead to revelations he wasn't prepared for. The investigation team working around her aircraft wreckage seemed particularly interested in the tail number, and Jake suspected that those numbers held secrets that went far beyond a simple aircraft identification. That evening, Jake found himself pacing nervously around the temporary quarters assigned to visiting aircrew. Mike had gone to the dining facility for dinner, but Jake was too anxious to eat. He kept thinking about Sarah and wondering what she had meant when she said there were things they needed to discuss. The entire situation felt surreal, like something from a movie rather than real life. Around 9 o'clock, there was a soft knock on Jake's door. He opened it to find Sarah standing in the hallway, wearing clean flight suits and looking more relaxed than she had earlier in the day. She had showered and changed after her debriefing sessions, and the stress lines around her eyes had softened somewhat. Jake invited her in and offered her a bottle of water from his small refrigerator. Sarah sat down on the single chair in the small room, while Jake sat on the edge of his narrow bed. The accommodations were basic but functional, typical of forward operating bases in combat zones. Neither of them spoke for several minutes, both seeming to struggle with where to begin their conversation. Sarah finally broke the silence by asking Jake about his combat experience and his current assignment. Jake told her about his deployment rotations and the various missions he had flown over the past few years. He had become an experienced fighter pilot with multiple air-to-air victories and hundreds of combat flying hours. Sarah listened attentively, occasionally asking questions about specific aspects of his service. When Jake finished describing his military career, he turned the conversation back to Sarah. He asked her directly about what had happened 8 years ago when she disappeared from the pilot training base. Sarah hesitated before answering, clearly weighing how much she could reveal about her subsequent assignments. Sarah explained that she had been recruited for a highly classified program that involved testing experimental aircraft and weapons systems. The program was so secret that participants were required to disappear from their previous assignments without explanation. Even their families were told only that they had been transferred to classified duties with no forwarding information. Jake listened with growing amazement as Sarah described her work over the past 8 years. She had been testing advanced versions of the A-10 that incorporated stealth technology and new weapon systems. The aircraft she had been flying when she was shot down was actually a prototype that looked identical to a standard A-10, but contained millions of dollars worth of classified modifications, the revelation explained. The unusual interest in Sarah's crashed aircraft. The investigation team wasn't just documenting an accident. They were recovering classified technology that couldn't be allowed to fall into enemy hands. The tail number on Sarah's aircraft was actually a coded identifier that marked it as part of the experimental program. Sarah told Jake that her mission today had been a field test of the modified A-10's combat capabilities. The aircraft had performed well despite being hit by multiple missiles, proving that the modifications had improved its survivability significantly. Her survival of the crash had provided valuable data about the effectiveness of the enhanced cockpit protection systems. Jake was fascinated by Sarah's description of the experimental program, but he was also troubled by the implications. She had been living a secret life for 8 years, cut off from friends and family, all in service to a classified military project. He asked her about the personal cost of such an assignment. Sarah's expression became more somber as she considered Jake's question. She admitted that the isolation had been difficult, especially in the early years of the program. She had been forced to give up all contact with people from her previous life, including family members and friends from her military service. The program had become her entire world. The conversation was interrupted by another knock on the door. Jake opened it to find Mike standing in the hallway with a concerned expression on his face. Mike apologized for the interruption, but said he needed to speak with Jake immediately about something urgent he had discovered. Sarah stood up and said she should leave to allow the 2 F-16 pilots to discuss their business privately. Jake asked her to wait, sensing that Mike's urgent news might be related to the events of the day. Sarah hesitated but agreed to stay, understanding that military secrets had a way of interconnecting in unexpected ways. Mike entered the room and closed the door behind him before speaking. He had been talking with some of the base personnel about the crash investigation, and he had learned something disturbing. The enemy forces that had shot down Sarah's A-10 had been specifically targeting her aircraft, not just engaging targets of opportunity. According to intelligence reports that Mike had managed to access, the enemy had received detailed information about Sarah's flight route and timing. They had positioned their surface-to-air missiles specifically to intercept her aircraft during the mission. This meant that someone with access to classified flight information had provided intelligence to enemy forces. Sarah's face went pale as she processed Mike's revelation. If the enemy had been specifically targeting her aircraft, it meant that her cover within the experimental program had been compromised. Someone knew about the classified modifications to her A-10 and had arranged for its destruction during the mission. Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the implications of Mike's discovery. Sarah hadn't just been unlucky enough to encounter enemy missiles during a routine mission. She had been deliberately set up to be shot down, possibly to prevent her from completing her test mission or to eliminate her as a security risk to the experimental program. The 3 pilots looked at each other in stunned silence as the full meaning of the situation became clear. Sarah was not just a survivor of combat damage. She was the target of a deliberate betrayal that had nearly cost her life. Someone within the military hierarchy had wanted her mission to fail, and they had been willing to collaborate with enemy forces to achieve that goal. Sarah broke the silence by asking Mike how much the base personnel knew about the intelligence leak. Mike replied that the information was still being analyzed. But there were suspicions that the betrayal had come from someone with high-level access to operational planning. The investigation was being handled by military intelligence specialists who had arrived at the base earlier that evening. Jake realized that Sarah was potentially in serious danger if someone within the military was actively working against her. The experimental program she was part of obviously involved information that someone was willing to kill to protect or expose. Sarah's survival of the mission might make her an even bigger target for whoever had arranged the betrayal. As the gravity of the situation sank in, the three pilots began discussing what Sarah should do next. It was clear that she couldn't simply return to her normal duties within the experimental program until the source of the intelligence leak was identified and eliminated. Her life might depend on staying hidden until the investigation could determine who was responsible for the betrayal. The next morning brought an unexpected visit from Colonel Amanda Hayes, the senior intelligence officer overseeing the investigation into the intelligence leak. She arrived at the base before dawn with a small team of specialists and immediately requested private meetings with all personnel who had been involved in the previous day's events. Sarah was her first interview. Colonel Hayes was a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s with graying hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with classified matters. She had spent most of her career investigating security breaches and tracking down sources of intelligence leaks. The case involving Sarah's compromised mission was particularly concerning because of the experimental program's strategic importance. During her interview with Sarah, Colonel Hayes revealed additional details about the intelligence investigation. The enemy forces that had targeted Sarah's aircraft had possessed not only her flight route and timing, but also specific technical information about her aircraft's capabilities. This suggested that the leak came from someone with direct access to the experimental program's most sensitive data. Sarah provided Colonel Hayes with a complete account of her mission, including details about the aircraft's performance and the specific weapon systems that had been used against her. She also shared her observations about the enemy's tactics and their apparent knowledge of her aircraft's vulnerabilities. Every piece of information could potentially help identify the source of the leak. Colonel Hayes asked Sarah about her contacts within the experimental program and whether she had noticed any unusual behavior or security concerns among her colleagues. Sarah had to think carefully about her answer, as she had been trained to maintain strict operational security even when talking with investigators. The culture of secrecy within the program made it difficult to identify potential threats. After completing her interview with Sarah, Colonel Hayes met with Jake and Mike to gather their perspectives on the previous day's events. She was particularly interested in their observations about the enemy's targeting accuracy and the timing of the missile attacks. Jake and Mike provided detailed accounts of what they had witnessed during the engagement and the subsequent rescue operation. Colonel Hayes also questioned Jake and Mike about their backgrounds and their connection to Sarah. Jake reluctantly revealed his previous relationship as Sarah's student during pilot training, explaining that he had recognized her only after seeing her face following the crash. The colonel made careful notes about this connection, understanding that personal relationships could sometimes be exploited in intelligence operations. During a break in the interviews, Sarah managed to speak privately with Jake and Mike outside the operations center. She was concerned about the direction of the investigation and the implications for everyone involved. The colonel's questions had suggested that the intelligence leak might involve multiple people working together, rather than a single compromised individual. Sarah told Jake and Mike that she had been thinking about the timing of their encounter the previous day. It seemed unlikely that their F-16s had been in the right place at the right time purely by coincidence. She suspected that someone had arranged for them to be available to escort her damaged aircraft, possibly as part of a larger plan that had gone wrong when she survived the missile attack. Jake was troubled by Sarah's suggestion that their rescue mission might have been orchestrated by the same people who had arranged the attack on her aircraft. He reviewed his memory of the previous day's events, looking for any signs that their tasking had been unusual or suspicious. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that their deployment to that particular area had been arranged on very short notice. Mike added that their mission briefing had been conducted by an intelligence officer he didn't recognize, rather than their usual operations personnel. The officer had provided specific coordinates and timing for their patrol, emphasizing the importance of maintaining radio contact with any aircraft in distress. At the time, it had seemed like standard operating procedure, but now it appeared more significant. The three pilots agreed that they needed to share these observations with Colonel Hayes, even though it might complicate the investigation. If their rescue mission had been part of a larger conspiracy, it was important for the investigators to understand the full scope of the operation. Sarah's survival might have disrupted plans that extended beyond simply destroying her experimental aircraft. When they returned to the operations center, they found Colonel Hayes reviewing documents with her investigation team. She looked up as they entered and indicated that she had additional questions based on her review of the mission records. The colonel had discovered discrepancies in the official reports that suggested someone had been manipulating operational information. Colonel Hayes revealed that the enemy forces involved in the attack on Sarah's aircraft had withdrawn from the area immediately after the engagement, rather than remaining to engage additional American aircraft. This withdrawal pattern was inconsistent with their usual tactics and suggested that they had achieved their specific objective of targeting Sarah's A-10. The colonel also informed them that preliminary analysis of the wreckage had revealed that Sarah's aircraft had been hit by missiles that were more advanced than the weapons typically available to enemy forces in that region. The missiles appeared to be of foreign manufacture and had been modified with guidance systems that shouldn't have been accessible to local insurgent groups. This evidence pointed to a sophisticated operation that involved not only intelligence leaks but also the provision of advanced weapons to enemy forces. The scope of the conspiracy was larger than anyone had initially suspected, and it likely involved multiple individuals in positions of significant authority within the military structure. Colonel Hayes asked Sarah about her knowledge of other pilots in the experimental program and whether any of them had experienced similar targeting during recent missions. Sarah recalled that 2 other test pilots had been shot down in the past month, both under circumstances that had initially been attributed to bad luck or improved enemy capabilities. The pattern was becoming clear to Colonel Hayes and her investigation team. Someone within the military hierarchy was systematically targeting pilots in the experimental program, possibly to steal classified technology or to eliminate personnel who had access to sensitive information. Sarah's survival represented a failure in this campaign, which meant she remained in significant danger. Colonel Hayes made the decision to place Sarah under protective custody until the investigation could identify and neutralize the threat. She would be transferred to a secure facility, where her safety could be guaranteed while the investigation continued. Jake and Mike would also be questioned further about their potential involvement in the conspiracy, though they appeared to be unwitting participants rather than active conspirators. As preparations were made for Sarah's transfer, she realized that her 8 years of secret service might be coming to an end. The experimental program would likely be suspended until the security breach could be resolved, and her role as a test pilot might be permanently compromised. The life she had built within the classified world was about to be destroyed by the same forces that had tried to kill her the day before. 3 weeks later, Jake received an encrypted message requesting his presence at a classified briefing at Langley Air Force Base. The message provided no details about the purpose of the meeting, but it was signed by Colonel Hayes and marked with the highest security classifications. Jake arranged leave from his regular duties and flew to Virginia, wondering what new developments had emerged in the investigation. The briefing room at Langley was filled with personnel Jake didn't recognize, representing various military and intelligence agencies. Colonel Hayes was present, along with several civilians in business suits who appeared to be senior government officials. Jake noticed that Mike was also in attendance, looking as confused as Jake felt about the reason for their summons. Colonel Hayes opened the briefing by announcing that the investigation into the intelligence leak had been successfully completed. The conspiracy had involved 3 high-ranking military officers and 2 civilian contractors who had been selling classified information about the experimental aircraft program to foreign intelligence services. All 5 individuals had been arrested and would face charges of treason and espionage. The conspiracy had been more extensive than anyone had initially realized. The perpetrators had been systematically targeting test pilots and stealing classified technology for over 2 years. Sarah's mission had been compromised as part of their efforts to obtain specific data about the latest modifications to the A-10 program. Her survival had provided the breakthrough that allowed investigators to uncover the entire operation. Jake learned that his and Mike's rescue mission had indeed been orchestrated by the conspirators, but not for the reasons Sarah had suspected. The conspirators had arranged for F-16 pilots to be in the area, to witness the destruction of Sarah's aircraft, and confirm that the classified technology had been eliminated. They had not anticipated that Sarah would survive the crash or that her escorts would recognize her. Colonel Hayes explained that Jake's recognition of Sarah had been the crucial factor in unraveling the conspiracy. His questions about her background and the circumstances of her disappearance 8 years earlier had prompted a more thorough investigation into the experimental program's security procedures. Without his personal connection to Sarah, the investigation might never have uncovered the full scope of the conspiracy. The briefing continued with a presentation about the recovered, classified technology and the extent of the information that had been compromised. The foreign intelligence services that had purchased the stolen data had gained significant insights into American aircraft capabilities, but they had not been able to obtain complete technical specifications because of security measures within the experimental program. Sarah entered the briefing room as the presentation was concluding, escorted by 2 security personnel. She looked tired but determined, having spent the past 3 weeks in protective custody while the investigation was completed. Jake was relieved to see that she appeared to be in good health and had not been harmed during the extended security operation. Colonel Hayes announced that Sarah would be receiving a commendation for her role in exposing the conspiracy and for her exceptional flying skills in surviving the attack on her aircraft. The experimental program would be restructured with enhanced security measures, and Sarah would be offered the opportunity to continue her role as a test pilot if she chose to do so. The briefing then took an unexpected turn as one of the civilian officials stood up to address Jake and Mike directly. He explained that their inadvertent role in uncovering the conspiracy had brought them to the attention of senior government officials who were impressed by their skills and discretion. They were being offered the opportunity to join a new classified program that would utilize their combat experience in innovative ways. Jake and Mike exchanged glances, both recognizing that they were being presented with a career opportunity that could change their lives dramatically. The official emphasized that participation in the program would require them to accept the same level of secrecy that Sarah had lived with for the past 8 years. They would need to disappear from their current assignments and assume new identities within the classified world. The decision would need to be made immediately, as the new program was scheduled to begin operations within the next month. Jake found himself thinking about Sarah's experience over the past 8 years and the personal sacrifices she had made in service to national security. He wondered if he was prepared to make similar sacrifices for his career and his country. Sarah spoke up during the discussion, offering her perspective on the challenges and rewards of working within classified programs. She acknowledged that the isolation and secrecy were difficult, but she emphasized that the work itself was incredibly rewarding and important to national defense. She had no regrets about her decision to join the experimental program 8 years earlier. During a break in the briefing, Sarah approached Jake privately to discuss his decision. She told him that she believed he had the skills and temperament necessary to succeed in classified work, but she wanted him to understand the full implications of such a commitment. Once he entered the classified world, his relationships with family and friends would be forever changed. Jake asked Sarah about her own plans now that the conspiracy had been exposed and the experimental program was being restructured. Sarah replied that she intended to continue her work as a test pilot, but with new aircraft and systems that promised to be even more advanced than what she had been flying. The work remained challenging and important, and she felt a responsibility to continue contributing to the program's success. As the briefing resumed, Jake realized that he was standing at a crossroads in his military career. He could return to his regular F-16 assignment and continue flying combat missions in conventional operations, or he could follow Sarah's path into the classified world of experimental aircraft and secret programs. The choice would define the rest of his career and potentially the rest of his life. Mike had apparently reached his own decision during the break, informing the officials that he was honored by the offer, but preferred to continue his current assignment. He felt that his experience and skills were better suited to conventional operations. and he was not prepared to make the personal sacrifices required for classified work. Colonel Hayes announced that Jake would have until the end of the day to make his decision about joining the classified program. She emphasized that there would be no negative consequences if he chose to decline the offer, but the opportunity would not be extended again in the future. The program needed pilots who were completely committed to its mission and security requirements. As the briefing concluded, Jake found himself alone with Sarah for the first time since their reunion 3 weeks earlier. They had been through an extraordinary experience together, from her crash and rescue to the discovery of the conspiracy that had targeted her. Now they were facing another major decision that could determine whether their paths would continue to intersect in the future. Jake walked slowly across the tarmac at Langley Air Force Base as the sun began to set on what had been the most important day of his military career. In his jacket pocket was a signed document accepting the offer to join the classified aircraft program. The decision had not been easy, but his conversation with Sarah had convinced him that this was the right path for his future. Sarah stood near the hangar where the briefing had been conducted, watching Jake approach with a mixture of anticipation and concern. She had been careful not to influence his decision directly, but she had shared her honest assessment of what life in the classified world would be like. The choice had to be entirely his own, but she hoped he would choose to join the program. When Jake reached Sarah, he pulled the signed document from his pocket and showed it to her without speaking. Sarah smiled for the first time since he had known her, a genuine expression of happiness that transformed her face completely. She told him that she was pleased by his decision and that she looked forward to working with him in the new program. Colonel Hayes appeared from the hangar and collected Jake's signed acceptance document. She informed them that they would both be transferred to a new facility in Nevada within the next week, where they would begin training on aircraft that were even more advanced than the experimental A-10 that Sarah had been flying. The program would involve testing technologies that wouldn't be revealed to the public for many years. Mike approached the group to say goodbye to Jake and Sarah before returning to his regular assignment. He congratulated Jake on his decision and expressed confidence that both pilots would excel in their new roles. Mike had decided that his own calling was in conventional fighter operations, but he respected his friend's choice to enter the classified world. As Mike departed for his flight back to his home base, Jake realized that he was saying goodbye to his old life in the Air Force. His friendships, his routine, and his identity as an F-16 pilot would all be left behind as he assumed a new role in the classified program. The transition would be challenging, but he felt ready for the adventure that lay ahead. Sarah told Jake about some of the aircraft he would be testing in the new program, describing capabilities that seemed almost science fiction in their advancement. The work would be demanding and occasionally dangerous, but it would also be at the cutting edge of aviation technology. Jake would be helping to develop the aircraft that would protect American interests for decades to come. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a black sedan that would transport Jake and Sarah to their temporary quarters for the night. Tomorrow they would begin the process of transitioning to their new identities and preparing for their transfer to Nevada. Colonel Hayes reminded them that from this point forward, their involvement in the classified program must remain completely secret. As they rode toward the temporary quarters, Sarah reflected on the events of the past month that had brought them to this point. Her near-death experience had led to the exposure of a major espionage operation and had reunited her with Jake after 8 years of separation. The coincidences seemed almost too remarkable to be believable, but they had all been documented and verified by the investigation. Jake asked Sarah about her expectations for their working relationship in the new program. They had been student and instructor 8 years earlier, but now they would be colleagues working at the same level on equally challenging assignments. Sarah replied that she was looking forward to the opportunity to work with someone she trusted and respected, especially given the isolating nature of classified work. The sedan arrived at a secure housing facility on the base where Jake and Sarah would spend their final night before beginning their new careers. They were assigned separate quarters, but were invited to share dinner in a common area reserved for personnel transitioning to classified assignments. The meal gave them an opportunity to discuss their hopes and concerns about the future. During dinner, Sarah shared some of the lessons she had learned during her 8 years in the experimental program. She emphasized the importance of maintaining perspective and finding ways to stay connected to the outside world despite the secrecy requirements. The work could be all-consuming if a person allowed it to become their entire identity. Jake told Sarah about his concerns regarding the personal sacrifices required for classified work. He had always been close to his family, and the prospect of limiting contact with them was troubling. Sarah acknowledged that this was one of the most difficult aspects of the job, but she assured him that there were ways to maintain important relationships while protecting operational security. As the evening concluded, Sarah and Jake walked together toward their quarters, both feeling a sense of anticipation about the challenges that awaited them. Their reunion under such dramatic circumstances had led to a partnership that promised to be both professionally rewarding and personally meaningful. The classified world they were entering would be demanding, but they would face it together. Jake paused at the door to his quarters and thanked Sarah for her guidance in helping him make the decision to join the program. He told her that he was honored to have the opportunity to work with her again, and that he looked forward to whatever missions they would be assigned. Sarah replied that she was equally pleased to have him as a colleague and friend. The next morning brought the beginning of their new lives as they boarded a military transport aircraft bound for Nevada. Jake took one last look at Langley Air Force Base as the aircraft taxied for takeoff, knowing that he might never return to this place where his old career had ended and his new one had begun. The future was uncertain, but he was confident that he had made the right choice. As the aircraft climbed into the morning sky, Sarah looked out the window at the landscape passing below. She thought about the experimental A-10 that had been destroyed in the crash that started this entire adventure. That aircraft had served its purpose by protecting her life and helping to expose the conspiracy that threatened the entire program. Now she and Jake would be testing even more advanced aircraft in service to their country's defense. The tail number on Sarah's crashed A-10 had indeed held secrets, just as Jake had suspected when he first saw the investigation team documenting the wreckage. Those secrets had led to the exposure of a major espionage operation and had brought together two pilots whose partnership would contribute to the development of the next generation of military aircraft. The silent moment when the F-16 pilots had first seen that tail number had marked the beginning of an adventure that would define the rest of their careers.